The body came down the bank at the bend of the Credit River on a Thursday evening in November, and Nora Cleave, river pilot's widow and ferryman's daughter, saw it from the landing before the current carried it into the shallows below the dock. She had been tallying the last of the autumn freight: 3 crates of glass destined for a Hamilton merchant, 2 barrels of salt pork, a trunk with a broken latch that she had bound with river cord and refused to charge extra for. The light was going. She had perhaps 20 minutes before she would need to bring the lantern down from the ferry house, and she was counting them carefully, the way she counted everything since her husband Reuben had drowned 18 months before, and left her the ferry crossing and the debt on the dock pilings, and a river she knew better than she knew the inside of her own hands. She saw the shape in the water and knew it was not a log. Logs did not catch on the sandbar that way. One arm out, one shoulder turned to the current, as if trying to resist it. She left the tallying. She went down the bank at a run in her boots. He was alive. That was the first surprise. The second was the coat, good wool, dark blue, the kind that was cut on King Street in Toronto, and not at the general store in Streetsville. The third surprise was the face, when she rolled him over in the shallows, young, perhaps 30, and not a riverman. His hands were wrong for a riverman. They were wrong for a farmer too. The knuckles were cut, and the right shoulder had been pulled out of its socket. She knew that injury, had seen it on men dragged from the river by the crossing chain, but the palms were clean under the river mud, the kind of clean that said his work was done with a pen and not a blade. She did not have time to think about what his work was. She had to get him out of the water before the temperature of it finished what someone had evidently begun. Nora Cleave was 31 years old and had been running a river ferry crossing for 18 months on her own. She had muscles in her arms that city women did not have, and she had the river rope coiled on the dock post, and she used it the way she had used it twice before for men who had gone in by accident, and once for a cow that most certainly had not. She looped it under his arms. She braced her boots against the dock post. She hauled. He came out of the shallows by degrees, heels dragging on the gravel bar, water streaming off him in dark sheets. She got him up the bank. She got him onto the dock planking. She turned him onto his side and put the heel of her hand between his shoulder blades, hard twice, and the river came out of him. He breathed. She let her own breath out for the first time since she had come down the bank. The freight sat untallied on the dock behind her. The light was gone now, and she would have to bring the lantern down, and the crate of glass would have to wait until morning. She looked at the man on her dock planking, and at the river going dark and cold behind her, and at the ferry house, 50 yards up the slope, with the one lit window. She fetched the rope again, and she dragged him up the slope to the house. Her daughter was at the table when Nora came through the door backward, with an unconscious man in tow. Bess was 8 years old, and had her father's eyes and her mother's habit of taking in a situation completely before saying anything about it. She sat very still and looked at the man on the floor, and then at her mother's face, and then at the rope still looped under the stranger's arms. She said, "Is he dead?" Nora said, "No." Bess considered this. She said, "Is he going to be?" Nora said, "Not tonight if I can help it." Bess climbed down from the table stool. She went to the hearth and fed the fire without being asked. She was that kind of child. The man had a fever coming on already. Nora could feel it in the skin of his forehead when she stripped his coat off and got the wet shirt away from his chest. The river in November did that to a man. The shoulder worried her more. She had set a dislocated shoulder once, on her cousin Matthias, after a barn raising gone wrong, and she knew the mechanics of it. But the man on her floor was not her cousin Matthias, and the joint had been out long enough that the muscles would resist. She poured 2 fingers of whiskey into the tin cup and got it past his lips, which was easier than she had expected, because he was coming in and out of consciousness. When his eyes opened, they were dark and unfocused and very confused. He said something. It wasn't English. She said, "French," he said in English. "Where?" And then stopped. She said, "Cleave's Crossing on the Credit River, below Streetsville. You were in the water." He closed his eyes. He said with considerable effort, "How long?" She said, "I don't know." "Long enough." She put her hand on his right shoulder, feeling for the joint. He flinched hard. She said, "Your shoulder's out. I'm going to put it back. Bite down on something." She gave him the edge of the horse blanket. He took it without argument, which told her he was in more pain than he was letting on, or sensible enough to trust her, or both. She set the shoulder on the third try. He went white to the lips, and did not make a sound she could hear over the crack of the fire. And then he lost consciousness entirely, which was probably a mercy. Bess, who had been watching from the doorway the whole time with the serious face of a child, who understood that useful work was required, said, "Mama, shall I heat the broth?" Nora said, "Yes, good girl." She got him onto the settle by the fire and covered him with the horse blanket and the good wool blanket from the chest, and she sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was perhaps 30. The coat had been good wool, and the shirt under it had been linen, not homespun. His boots, before she'd pulled them off and set them to dry, had been leather-soled riding boots, well-made and not new, the kind a man wore daily because he rode daily. He had no wallet, he had no papers. He had a knife still in his boot, which told her whoever had put him in the river had not searched him carefully, or had been interrupted, or had not considered a boot knife worth the trouble. The knife had a crest on the handle. She set it on the shelf above the fire and looked at it for a while, and did not say anything. The fever ran for 3 days. Nora knew fever the way she knew the river, the way it came up at night, the way it peaked before dawn, the way a man's breath changed when the worst of it was breaking. She had sat at Reuben's bedside the last 2 winters of his chest sickness, and she had learned the cadences of it, the particular arithmetic of sleep and waking and wet cloth and willow bark tea. She kept the fire, she kept the broth, she kept Bess out of the way during the worst of it, though Bess was not easily kept out of anything. On the second night he said a name, the way men said names in fever, not to anyone in the room, but to the inside of something he was living through while the fever had him. He said it twice, a woman's name. Marguerite. Nora wrung the cloth and laid it across his forehead, and did not say anything back. Bess, who should have been asleep and was not, came to the doorway in her nightgown, and stood there with her arms crossed against the chill, and her father's eyes opened very wide. She watched the man on the settle for a moment. Then she signed something with her hands, a small private language she and Nora had built between them, because Bess had been born with a heart that sometimes stopped and a childhood spent in bed, listening to the world rather than moving through it. And she had learned early that watching was a kind of work. Her hands said, "He is afraid of something that is not the fever." Nora looked at her daughter. She said quietly, "Go back to bed." Bess went. She left the door open 2 inches behind her, which Nora allowed. On the third morning the fever broke. He opened his eyes, and they were dark brown and entirely clear, and he looked at the ceiling of the ferry house for a long time before he looked at Nora in the chair beside him. He said, "I apologize." His voice was low and a little rough from the fever, and held the particular flat vowels of someone educated in Upper Canada, not in England. She noted that. She said, "You have nothing to apologize for. You were in the river," he said. "I know why I was in the river." She waited. He did not continue immediately. He looked at the shelf above the fire and at the knife with the crest on the handle, and something in his face went very still. She said, "It was in your boot. I thought you'd want it kept." He said, "Yes," and then, "Thank you." She brought him broth and he took it sitting up, which was an improvement on the last 3 days. He ate slowly and without speaking, and she watched him the way she watched the river in weather she did not trust, with full attention and no particular urgency. After he had eaten, he said, "My name is Thomas Wardell. I am a barrister. I came up from Toronto on Wednesday morning to review a property survey for a client in Brampton, and I was returning along the river road when I was pulled from my horse at the bridge." She said, "Who pulled you?" He said, "2 men. I did not know them." He paused. "I knew the man who hired them." She looked at him steadily. She said, "The sheriff's office in Streetsville opens at 9 in the morning." He said, "I know." She waited. He said, "The man who hired them is Arthur Graves, QC, Senior Crown Counsel for the District of Gore. He sits on the bench in Hamilton 3 days a week and has done so for 11 years. The sheriff in Streetsville reports to the county clerk in Hamilton. The county clerk in Hamilton reports to the district office." He stopped. "You understand the difficulty?" She understood it. She had grown up as a ferryman's daughter on a river crossing, where the county men came through twice a year, and were owed various small courtesies by every man on the bank. She understood what a chain of reporting meant when the man at the top of it was the problem. She said, "Why does he want you in the river?" He looked at his hands. He said, "I have a survey, a boundary survey from 1823, commissioned by the Crown and subsequently altered. The alteration removed 400 acres of riverfront land from the public commons and placed it in private holding." He paused. "The private holding belongs to Arthur Graves," she said, "and the original survey," he said, "is in my saddlebag, which is presumably still attached to my horse, which is presumably somewhere between the bridge and Brampton." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "My husband's brother James runs a livery in Brampton. He knows every road horse between here and the lake." He looked at her. He said, "Mrs." She said, "Cleave, Nora Cleave, the crossing is mine." He said, "Mrs. Cleave, you have already pulled me out of a river and set my shoulder and kept me alive for 3 days. I will not ask anything more of you," she said. "You didn't ask. I am telling you what I know." She stood up and took the broth bowl to the wash basin. She said, without turning around, "The land in the original survey, the 400 acres on the riverfront. That is the land the Mississauga families were promised use of under the 1818 arrangement. My father's crossing runs along the edge of it. He ferried those families across this river for 30 years. I know what that land is, and I know who it was meant for." She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth. She turned around. She said, "I will write to James in Brampton tonight. I will ask him to look for a bay horse with a Crown Lands saddlebag. I will not tell him why." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Cleave," she said, "we will talk about the rest in the morning. You need to sleep." He did not argue. He was still a man who had been in a November river for an unknown number of hours and had run a 3-day fever, and sleep was not an argument she had to press. She banked the fire. She listened to his breathing even out. She went to the door of Bess's small room and looked in. Bess was lying on her back, with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling. Nora said softly, "What is it?" Bess signed, "The man on the settle. He is not telling you everything yet." Nora said, "I know that." Bess signed, "But he will." Nora looked at her daughter for a long moment. She said, "Go to sleep." She went to the writing table and she wrote to James Wardell. Cleave, she caught herself. James Cleave, Reuben's brother, who had never once in 18 months made her feel the crossing was not rightfully hers. And she folded the letter and sealed it and set it by the door for the morning post rider. Then she sat for a while looking at the knife on the shelf. The letter to James came back on the Saturday with a single line at the bottom. "Bay mare found at Forsyth's mill gate Friday morning. Saddlebag intact, locked. Am holding her at the livery. Come yourself or send word." She showed Thomas the letter. He read it twice. He said, "The bag has a combination lock. I set it myself." She said, "Then we need to go to Brampton." He said, "I cannot be seen on the Brampton road." "If Graves has men watching," she said, "I make the Brampton crossing twice a week for freight. I am the ferryman, and I go where freight takes me. No one looks twice at a ferry wagon." She paused. "You would need to be in the back, under the canvas." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was not quite pride and not quite shame, the look of a man who was accustomed to being the one with the plan and was being handed someone else's, and could see that it was better than anything he had. He said, "Yes, all right," she said, "and Bess comes. She always comes on the Brampton run. If she's not there, it's wrong." He looked toward the door of Bess's room. He said carefully, "The child," Nora said, "Bess does not need to be protected from situations. She needs to be told what they are." She said it evenly, without particular heat. It was not the first time someone had said the child in that tone, and it would not be the last. She got Bess up at 5 in the morning and told her plainly. A man named Thomas Wardell was a barrister who had a document that a powerful man wanted destroyed, and they were going to help him fetch it. And if anyone on the road asked, he was a hired hand she was taking north for the winter freight. Bess listened to all of this with the same face she used for tallying numbers, and then signed. "Does he know I will see through whatever he isn't saying?" Nora said, "He's learning." They left at first light. Thomas was in the wagon bed under the canvas with the empty salt barrels, and it was cold and uncomfortable, and Nora could tell from the way the canvas lay that he was trying not to shift and make noise, and she respected him for it without saying so. The road to Brampton was bare and frost-grey. Bess sat on the bench beside Nora, with her hands in her coat pockets and her father's eyes on the tree line. Nora had been driving this road since she was Bess's age. She knew where the crown of it heaved in April frost, and where it went soft in May rains, and where the bridge over the East Branch Creek had a plank that needed watching. She knew the Forsyth Mill Gate and the livery behind the main street, and James Cleave's particular way of standing in the livery door with his arms crossed, that meant he was not entirely surprised by whatever she was bringing him. He was standing that way when she pulled in. He looked at the wagon. He looked at the canvas. He looked at Nora. He said, "Freight?" She said, "Hardware." He said, "I see." He did not ask further. He went inside and came back with the saddlebag. She took it to the wagon and handed it under the canvas and waited while Thomas worked the lock. She heard the click. She heard him go very still. He said from under the canvas, quietly, "It's here," she said. "Good." James had brought the bay mare around to the livery rail by the time Thomas climbed out of the wagon, stiffly, and with a care that showed the shoulder was still earning its keep, and the two men looked at each other across the yard. Thomas said, "You're her husband's brother." James said, "I was." Thomas said, "She drove 2 hours at 5 in the morning and didn't tell me you'd look at me like that." James said, "She doesn't tell you everything right away. It's a character trait." He looked at the saddlebag. He said, "What's in it?" Thomas told him. Not everything, Nora thought. Not yet, but enough, the survey. The alteration, the 400 acres, the Crown Council in Hamilton. James listened to all of it without interrupting. When Thomas had finished, James looked at Nora. He said, "The Crown Lands Survey from 1823. Your father talked about that survey." She said, "I know," he said. "He talked about it when they took the Commons' access away from the families he'd been ferrying. He said there'd been a survey and it'd been changed." She said, "I know, James." He looked at the saddlebag. He said, "What do you need?" What they needed was a copy. Nora understood copying. She had kept her father's crossing ledgers for 6 years before Reuben had taken over, and she had a clerk's hand and a clerk's eye, and she knew that a document with one copy was a document that could be made to disappear. And a document with 3 copies in 3 different places was a different kind of thing entirely. James knew a man in Brampton with a copying press, not a full printing operation, but a small letterpress used for the land office forms. They got the survey to him by noon. By 3 o'clock there were 4 copies on good linen paper, each one witnessed by James and signed in James's hand, and Nora took 1 copy, and Thomas took 1, and James kept 1, and the 4th went into the keeping of the minister at the Methodist Church on Main Street, who had known Nora's father and asked no questions. Thomas looked at the copies laid out on James's kitchen table, and he was quiet for a long time. He said, "There should be an original stamp, a Crown Lands seal. Without the original, the copies are evidentiary but not definitive." Nora said, "What does the original look like?" He said, "It would be in the survey itself. A wax impression with the Crown Lands office mark and the surveyor's registration number." He paused. "The original survey is in the document. Here," he pointed. The seal was cut from it cleanly, with a blade. She looked at the cut edge of the document. She said, "A bookbinder's blade. That cut is too clean for a penknife." He looked at her. He said, "You know bookbinding," she said. "My mother bound books for the lending library in York before she married my father. I spent 10 winters watching her." She looked at the cut edge. She said, "There will be a second seal." Surveyors registered their work twice, once on the primary document and once on the deposit copy lodged with the district office. The deposit copy is required by statute to be kept in perpetuity. He went very still. He said, "The district office in Hamilton." She said, "Where Arthur Graves sits on the bench 3 days a week." He said, "Yes." She said, "But not in the bench rooms, in the district registrar's office. The registrar in Hamilton is Samuel Hogg. He has been the registrar for 22 years, and he does not, to my knowledge, sit on any of Arthur Graves's committees." She said it calmly, the way she said everything, laying it out the way she laid out freight manifests. "My father ferried Samuel Hogg's brother across this river for 15 years. I know Samuel Hogg's name, and I know his father's name, and I know that he is a man who has spent 22 years keeping records, and would not thank anyone who tried to interfere with them." Thomas looked at her for a long time. He said, "How do you know all of that?" She said, "I am a ferryman's daughter. People talk on river crossings. They always have," he said, Mrs. Cleave. And then he stopped, as if he had meant to say something after it, and had misplaced it. She said, "We will need to go to Hamilton." James said from the doorway, "I'll drive." They went to Hamilton on Monday morning, James driving, Nora beside him on the bench, Thomas inside the cab, Bess beside Thomas with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the road through the window glass. Thomas had been, Nora noticed, careful with Bess. He had not talked down to her or around her or treated her like furniture, the way some men did with children. He talked to her directly and waited for her to answer. And when she signed, he watched her hands without the particular blankness people wore when they didn't know what to do with something they didn't understand. He did not understand the signs, but he watched them as if he might learn. On the road she told him about Bess's heart. Not everything. Some of it was not for the cab of a hired coach on the way to Hamilton. But enough. The early years. The doctors in York who had said various things that had not helped. The way Bess had simply decided, at around age 5, that she was going to be well enough for what she needed to do, and had organised her life accordingly. Thomas listened to all of it without the face men sometimes made, the face that said what a difficulty or how trying for you both. He said at the end, "She has her mother's way of assessing a situation." Nora said, "She has her own way, I just recognise it." Bess, without looking up from the window, signed, "He is a quick learner," Nora said. "She says you're a quick learner." Thomas looked at Bess. He said, "I am trying to be." Bess nodded once formally and went back to the window. Samuel Hogg was a compact man of 60, with a registrar's precision and a registrar's memory for what was and was not where it ought to be. He received them in the district records office, which smelled of beeswax and old paper, and the particular dry cold of a room that was kept aired for the preservation of documents. Nora had written ahead. A single letter, 3 sentences, mentioning her father's name and the Hogg family crossing and the survey of 1823. The letter had arrived that morning. Samuel Hogg had pulled the deposit copy before they reached his door. He laid it on the reading table. He laid Thomas's survey copy beside it. He looked at the cut edge of Thomas's copy where the seal had been. He looked at the deposit copy's seal, intact, wax and clear, the Crown Lands mark and the surveyor's registration number. He said very quietly, "I see." Thomas said, "The primary document was in my saddlebag. The seal was removed before my client received it. I did not examine it closely until recently." Samuel Hogg said, "Recently meaning the day someone put you in a river." Thomas said, "Yes." Samuel Hogg looked at the 2 documents side by side for a long time. He said, "I have had 3 letters in the last 8 years from Mr. Graves's office requesting that this deposit copy be transferred to the Hamilton District Courthouse for centralised storage. I declined each time on grounds of archival protocol." He paused. "I understand now why the requests were made." He looked at Nora. He said, "Your father would have known what to do with this." She said, "He would have put it in front of a judge." He said, "The judge in Hamilton." She said, "Not Hamilton. The Queen's Bench in Toronto. The Solicitor General's office." She looked at Thomas. "That is where this needs to go. Not to the county level. Over it." Thomas said, "The Solicitor General's office will require a sworn statement, an affidavit. Witnesses." He said it not as an objection but as a checklist, the way a man goes through the things he needs to build. Samuel Hogg said, "I will swear to the condition of the deposit copy and the dates of the requests from Mr. Graves's office and my refusals. I will swear to it in writing and in person." He looked at Thomas over the reading table. He said, "And you, Mr. Wardell, you will swear to the river?" Thomas said, "Yes." He looked at Nora. She said, before he could ask, "I will swear to pulling him out of it." Bess, in the chair by the window where she had been sitting with her coat still buttoned and her hands in her lap, looked up and signed something. Nora watched the signs. She translated without thinking about it. "Bess says she will swear to the shoulder." Thomas looked at Bess. He said, "The shoulder?" Bess signed again. Nora said, "She counted the tries. She says she will swear that it took 3 attempts and that you did not make a sound any of the 3 times which she says speaks well of you." Thomas looked at the child in the chair by the window. He said, "I think I made a sound on the 3rd one." Bess shook her head firmly. Something happened to his face then. Not the controlled expression he wore in the records office or the careful attention he gave to the documents on the table, but something underneath that, older and less managed. He looked at Bess in the chair and at Nora at the table, and he pressed his lips together once and looked away at the records room window and the grey November street outside it. The affidavits went to the Solicitor General's office in Toronto by registered post on the Tuesday, with copies to a barrister known to Thomas, and a second copy to a member of the Legislative Assembly from York County, whom James knew through the Agricultural Committee. They waited. Nora ran the crossing. She ran it the way she had run it for 18 months, getting up before light and checking the river level, and tallying the freight and ferrying what needed ferrying. The water was cold enough now that she kept the ice pole in the bow at all times, and watched the eddy lines the way her father had taught her to watch them. Thomas stayed at the ferry house. He had not said he was staying. He had not asked. On the morning after they returned from Hamilton, he had come down from the loft room she'd given him. Reuben's brother had stayed there for 3 months after the drowning, and it still held the particular smell of a room kept for guests who were needed, and he had gone down to the dock and begun repairing the bow rope on the second raft, without being asked. She had watched him from the ferry house door for a moment. She had not said anything. He was not a riverman. The rope work was careful but slow, and he held the coil wrong, and she went down and showed him twice without comment, and the third time he held it correctly, and she left him to it. He helped with the freight tallying after that. His handwriting was a barrister's hand, clear and even and given to precision, and he was faster at the sums than she was, which she noted without particular feeling. He was faster at the sums. She was faster at the river. They divided accordingly. Bess watched all of this from the dock post, where she habitually sat when they were working, with her coat buttoned and her hands in her pockets. She did not offer opinions. She watched the way she always watched. On the fourth evening, she came in for supper and signed to Nora while Thomas was bringing in wood. He is not the same as he was at the beginning. Nora said, people change when they stop being sick. Bess shook her head. She signed. Not that. He moves differently. He is not waiting to leave. Nora looked at her daughter for a long moment. She said, set the table. Bess, set the table. She put 3 places, which she had been doing since the second night, without being asked. The answer from the Solicitor General's office came on a Thursday, 10 days after the affidavits had been sent. It came in the form of a letter to Thomas, and a second letter to Samuel Hogg in Hamilton, and a third, which Thomas told her about in the evening after Bess was in bed, which had gone to the Chief Clerk of the Queen's Bench, and which had opened an inquiry into the 1823 Survey Amendment and the circumstances by which it had been made. Graves had been asked to appear before the Queen's Bench the following month. Thomas told her this, sitting on the bench by the fire, with the letters in his hand, and his voice was very even, the way it was always even, and she could see the thing under it that he was not saying. She said, "What is the other part?" He said, "The other part." She said, "There is always another part." He looked at the fire. He said, "He will know. He will know the survey found the registrar's office, because there is no other way the Solicitor General's office could have had the deposit copy by Tuesday. And he will know that I am alive, and that I have someone who will swear to the river." He paused. "He will come here," she said. "I know," he said, "Nora." And then he stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name. He had said Mrs. Cleave for 10 days with the particular correctness of a man who was aware of the rules about such things. She did not comment on it. She said, "I have been on this crossing for 18 months alone. Before that I was here with Reuben for 4 years, and before that I grew up here in my father's house. There is not a man in Streetsville or Brampton or Port Credit who would come onto this bank without my knowing it before he got to the dock." She said it without heat, simply. "James will come tomorrow. He is already coming. I wrote to him on Monday." Thomas said, "You wrote to him on Monday." She said, "You were going to tell me about Graves eventually." "I thought Monday was the right time to have James on his way." He looked at her. He said, "You did not tell me you had written." She said, "No." He was quiet for a moment. Then something happened in his face that she had not seen before. Not the river careful expression, not the barrister's precision, but something plainer and less managed than either, and almost startled, as if it had arrived in him without announcement. He said, "I had a case 8 years ago. A woman brought it to me. She had a river crossing, not this one north of here, and the county had tried to reclaim the dock pilings as public infrastructure, and she would have lost the crossing if the case had not been brought correctly." He looked at the fire. "I brought it correctly. She kept her crossing. I thought about that case afterward, about what it had meant to her, and I thought I had understood it." He paused. "I did not understand it until I came out of this river," she said. "What did you understand?" he said. "That a crossing is not a piece of property, that what it represents is not transferable and not compensable." He looked at his hands, the barrister's clean palms and the healing knuckles. "That the person who runs it is not simply an operator of a service," she said. "No," he said. "I am asking you something badly, and I know I am asking it badly." He said it with a directness that was, she thought, as close as he was capable of getting to vulnerability. "I have a practice in Toronto. I have chambers on King Street. I have no living family in Upper Canada, and I have been, since Marguerite, which is a long story and not tonight's. I have been a man who works and does not do much else, and I had not noticed the cost of that until 10 days ago on this riverbank." He stopped. "I am asking if there is a reason I should look for chambers near Streetsville." She looked at him, she said. "The bar in Streetsville is not the Toronto bar," he said. "I know that," she said. "The crossing is mine. I will not give it up and I will not leave it," he said. "I know that too," she said. "Bess comes first in everything." He said, "I know," she said. "The Marguerite story needs to be told. Not tonight, but told." He said, "Yes, I know that too." She looked at the fire for a moment. She said, "James will be here tomorrow. After James, we will see what Graves does and what the bench decides. After that," she paused. "After that, ask me again." He said, "And you'll answer," she said. "I'll answer." He nodded. He looked at the fire. He did not reach across the bench between them. He sat with his hands on his own knees, close enough that she could see the healing line across his right knuckle. And after a while she put her hand beside his on the bench, and he looked down at it and then put his over it and left it there. The fire burned down. Outside, the Credit River ran cold and dark over its gravel bars in the November night, the way it had run through every November she had known. James arrived on the Friday morning with the survey copies in a locked box, and a cousin of his wife's who was a constable in Peel County and had jurisdiction over the river road where the bridge was. Graves sent 2 men to the crossing on the Saturday night. They found James at the dock with the Peel constable and a second constable from Streetsville who owed James 3 favours from a barn fire 2 winters back, and they turned around at the dock post and did not come back. On the Sunday morning, Thomas wrote a letter to the Queen's Bench, stating that the party who had made the attempt on his life had sent men to the landing at Cleave's Crossing and naming the date and the witnesses. The Peel constable signed it. The Streetsville constable signed it. James signed it. Nora signed it. Thomas sealed it himself, and they rode it to the post office in Streetsville together, Thomas on the bay mare, and Nora in the ferry wagon with Bess beside her, and it went by the Monday morning rider. Arthur Graves appeared before the Queen's Bench in December. He did not appear well. The deposit copy was clear, the surveyor's registration number was clear, and Samuel Hogg's 22 years of archival precision were, as it turned out, not a thing that withstood cross-examination badly. The 2 men from the Saturday night had not been hard to find. Peel County constables were thorough. Graves was disbarred in January. The criminal matter was set for the spring sessions. The 400 acres on the riverfront reverted to public designation. On an evening in March, with the ice coming off the Credit River and the first of the spring freight running on the road from Toronto, Nora was at the dock counting the load when Thomas came down the bank path from the house. He had been in Streetsville since November. He had taken rooms above the land agent's office on the main street in December, and he had begun a local practice in January, and it was small and it was not King Street, and she had watched him understand what he had chosen without once appearing to regret it. He came down the bank and stood at the dock post and watched her count the load. She knew he was there. She finished the count. He said, "There's a piece of news from Toronto." She said, "Good or bad?" he said. "Mixed. The spring sessions will be May. Graves will likely not go to prison. His age and the state of his health are against it, but the disbarment stands and the restitution order stands. The families with claims on the riverfront commons can bring their applications in April. She said, "My father would have driven to Toronto for that." He said, "I think James intends to." She said, "James should." She set down the tally board. She looked at the river, which was running high and cold and full of the winter it was carrying away. She said, "You said you would ask again." He said, "I remember." She said, "Ask then." He stood at the dock post with his hands at his sides and the river behind him, and the pale March light on his face, and he looked at her the way he looked at documents he was about to sign, with full attention and no reservation. He said, "I would like to stay, not in rooms above the land agent's office, here, on the crossing, with you and Bess, if Bess will have me." He paused. "I am asking for what's here, not for what comes after. I am not promising anything I cannot see from where I stand. But from where I stand, I can see this dock and this river, and you counting freight in the March cold, and I would like the right to come down this bank path every morning." She looked at him. She said, "Bess has already decided," he said. "What did she decide?" Nora said, "She told me on the second day that you were a quick learner and that you held the rope wrong but would improve. She said you looked at the river the way people look at things they are going to learn." She paused. "Bess is not often wrong," he said. "And you," she said. "I pulled you out of the river in November. I have had all winter to think about what I was pulling you out for." She looked at his face. "Not for before, not for what comes after. For here," he said. "For here." She held out her hand. He took it, not carefully, not as if it were a question, but the way she had seen him take hold of the rope when he'd finally learned the right way to coil it, firmly and without wasted motion. Behind them, the Credit River shed the last of the winter ice over its gravel bars and ran clear the way it always ran in March, carrying everything it no longer needed toward the lake. On the dock post, the crossing rope hung ready the way it had hung in her father's time, and Reuben's time and her own. Bess was on the bench outside the ferry house in her coat, with her hands in her pockets and her father's eyes on the river. She watched her mother and the man at the dock, and then she looked at the water and signed something small and private to herself, or perhaps to the river, or perhaps to no one in particular. Not before, not after, here.